Hello, everyone, and welcome to Classical Revolution here on IDAGIO. My name is Rachel Fenlon, and this is my weekly series in which I get the great pleasure of chatting with guests in the classical music world, people who really inspire me, and chatting with them about what pushing boundaries feels like for them in classical music or what rule breaking feels like. Today, I'm joined by composer Lisa Streich. Born in Sweden, Lisa is a profound and moving composer with a very unique musical voice. She's received prizes from the Siemens Foundation, the Young Commission Prize from the Lucerne Festival. She's attended Villa Massimo. She's a laureate of the Ricordi Lab, and she's been commissioned by the Bayerische Staatsoper, by the Köln Philharmonic, Lucerne Festival, Collegium Novum of Zurich, and the Ensemble Recherche, just to name a few. It's a real pleasure to have her here on the show today. Hi, Lisa, welcome.
Hey, Rachel. Hello.
Thanks for joining us. It's so nice to have you here.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Lisa, I'd love to just begin by asking you what your earliest introductions to music were, and whether there are any particular musical memories that jump out to you.
Yeah, I think my first really love moment with music was when my mom, who's an English teacher, she taught West Side Story with her class, and so she put on the CD. And I remember that it was a profound experience. And I think I was 3, something like that.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
This is my first clear memory of music.
Interesting. And I read that you were an organist as well in the beginning.
Yeah, or in between, one can say. Yeah.
Yeah. So was the organ for you the sort of first instrument that you interacted with music with?
No, I started with the violin and the piano, very classically, but I never felt very at home on the stage. And then, so I tried to find ways to make music without being on stage. And that was then the organ and composing.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. My organist friends say the same, actually.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Kind of a side question, I'm just coming to me now. Do you perform any of your own works? Have you ever done that? Did you used to improvise on the organ, or?
I have performed, but I don't do anymore. I don't have time. And basically, after I did my exam in organ, I have hardly touched the organ, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunate. I would like to do it more, but it's not possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's an instrument you must need to devote a lot of time to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh. In an interview that you give like quite recently with the Elbphilharmonic in their magazine, you talk about sort of going through a transformation musically, kind of starting your musical voice starting out being quite avant-garde and academic and provocative in this way, and then going through a sort of transformation where you started to write for beauty, not against it. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about when that happened. Was that a very specific moment for you, or was that a series of things that came to be?
Yeah, I mean, when you're young, like when you start studying, you want to kind of go against the establishment, but then you notice that it's not going against the establishment. It's very much going with it, and it's what people expect from you to do, kind of, especially in new music scene and world. But also, as you grow older, you're not so rebellious anymore, I think. But what for me really catches my interest is to try to create a beauty that is not, how to speak, superficial, or trying to make the listener it very easy, or like some spa moment or something. It's not what I'm looking for. It's more like to really try to find out what can be beauty today after everything we have heard in history. And so, yeah, and I think it's a field that is still quite undeveloped somehow.
Absolutely, especially in contemporary music, in this very broad word for this genre, which I think is a very broad word.
Yeah.
What's your relationship, for example, with harmony as a composer?
Yeah, I use it a lot, but not in its original form, so to speak. I work a lot with recordings from mostly choirs, which are amateur choirs, where the harmonies are a little bit off, but then I get a certain new, I can experience a minor chord new or for the first time again. And then I analyze what's happening there in that moment that I find special for the harmony. And then I orchestrate that, so to speak, for the orchestra, for example, with 40 different voices. And the chord is still there, but there's so much happening around, but very quietly. So somehow you get a perspective on top of the known thing that you know. Here, kind of, I always call it a wing in my imagination, but yeah.
So it's as if like our ideas of harmony can always be transforming given different contexts, or is that sort of?
And you can finally maybe experience it for the first time again, even though you hear it constantly.
Exactly. Yeah. And why work with amateur choirs? Is that something that you do deliberately?
It's just because I don't sing right.
Okay.
It's the moment I search for it, like which chords are beautiful when they are a little bit off, and then I steal this moment, so to speak. So one can say my music is a lot of special moments for me personally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. It reminds me of when I was younger. I used to really love an out of tune piano for some reason. Just it maybe was nostalgic or something, but it had it. Yeah. So
it's similar, I think. Yeah.
Do you tend as a composer to gravitate towards certain instruments? Like, do you feel a particular connection with certain instruments or configurations or ensembles?
I mean, it goes it changes. Right now, I'm very much into big formations. And of course, the string instruments are kind of close to me and more easy to grasp because I played the violin and all the key instruments. But I had this very important experience. I got a string orchestra commission, and I always wanted to have one for string orchestra because then I thought I don't have to think about the winds and so on. But I had had some commissions before then with winds, and then finally I had this string orchestra, and then I missed all the winds because the strings were somehow only the skin, the outer part of the body of the orchestra, and everything else was missing. So I think now with some experience, I appreciate every instrument and I can see its qualities, and some are still more easy to write for. But I think I love every instrument for what it is.
Interesting. So I know you had this commission for the Bayerische Staatsoper. Do you have an interest in writing opera? I mean, I'm a singer, so I felt I had to ask you. And sort of generally, what's your take on contemporary music theater, for example?
Yeah, I very much want to step into it more. I feel I'm very I'm of course a beginner, but it feels very interesting to me because the the audience is much more diverse, I feel. And
Yeah.
that's very interesting. And I'm going to write a piece. It's still an orchestra piece, but with a visual element, and it will be costumes for the Staatsoper Hannover.
Oh.
So this will, I see it a little bit, my first, one more step towards evening filling opera, hopefully one day.
Yes.
Mm.
Does that piece, is there a sort of narrative or a text involved in that particular piece?
No, I don't think so. It's for 2023, so I'm still just in the beginning of thinking.
Okay.
But most likely there won't be a text. No, and no singers neither. So yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
I think it's always interesting to speak with composers. On this show is a great opportunity about, what their ideas of what opera is, because it's this whole other kind of beast,
Yeah, it's so diverse also, and
yeah.
yeah.
And you're dealing with text and a story, and it's
so much history, and but I think what's the A&O, how you say in Germany, is to find your counterpart, the right director, or
yes.
So, and then I think one can make fantastic things. Yeah.
Absolutely. I know that you, so you live on an island in Sweden, and you live, I think, 500 meters from the ocean. And I had to think, do you feel, first, is nature a really important part of your daily life? And do you feel it's embodied within your music somehow?
Yeah, I don't know. People always think that, but of course it's a big part because it's right in the wilderness. But I think, on the contrary, like when I used to live in cities, I was so dependent on having quiet time and traveling to the countryside to my mother or something to have it quiet, and then I think I also wrote a very quiet music, so to speak. And now when I'm here in the quiet, I can write loud music also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There must be a great feeling of space.
Yeah. And I think the ocean is always somehow a connection point to the world. I always feel when I go swimming, then I'm connected to the whole world, and it's a very important part to be close to a water somehow.
I can relate with that, coming from an island as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and living now in Berlin and missing the ocean, truly, just the ocean.
Yeah.
Do you work with live electronics or electronics at all? And do you ever kind of use sounds from the natural world? I mean, just very technically, does that ever implement itself in your work?
No, I know that my very first piece was with musique concrète and recorded pieces, but I don't work with electronics in the normal sense. What I've done is that I built some motorized instruments, which have been a big interest to me, and yeah, and then those are amplified sometimes, so it comes a little bit electronic in there, but it's mostly mechanic, but it's kind of, one could say, non-human layer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's an example of a motorized instrument? I mean,
my first instrument was a violoncello, and then there were 4 motors attached who did different things on the cello. One was scraping on the wood. It sounded like a train. And then one was scraping in the F hole. And it sounded a little bit like a printer. So on the motors are always paper stripes attached, so it's important to know. And then was a little plastic strap attached to one motor on the tail piece. and that sounded a little bit like cracking glass. And then one behind the bridge, which was plucking the strings behind the bridge. And then I use this not alone, but in connection with the human playing. So there is a kind of contrast in the visual picture for the listener that he, she can relate to as well.
And are elements of that, and it's such a new idea for me, is it controlled by your player, or is it controlled externally, or?
Yeah, it can be controlled by a computer or with a fader by another musician.
Okay, I see. But not the cellist themselves, for example.
He can just trigger the computer.
Okay.
Yeah. Like when he triggers them, he can trigger the motors. Yeah.
Mm. Okay. And I mean, do you think about sort of, I mean, yeah, what's your sort of relationship with pushing technological things? And do you want to explore more of that? Do you feel compelled to, or you feel, yeah, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I don't think that I'm like stressing any boundaries technically. It's very simple mechanic action. But it is, of course, a boundary of, I mean, you have to, the musician has to allow to attach this little motor that can be kind of precarious. It doesn't harm the instrument, but of course it's always a very sensitive moment. And then you have somehow you're so integrated with your instrument, and it's yours, and it's only you who are playing on it, and then suddenly somebody else is playing on it too. So it creates a kind of precarious moment in the beginning. Yeah, and I think always it also touches the question machine against human, of course, and it triggers a lot of ideas and thoughts in the listener, I hope. I think in general it's very compelling to me, and there's also a charming aspect that something is turning. It's very playful in a way, but it's also very, very aggressive, harmful. It has so many dimensions that are interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think exactly, even just on a visual level, aside from the oral level, it just makes me think of, toys as a kid playing. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you also have the time, of course, the clock is always turning. You have that aspect too. And then, yeah, it's just another layer of creating contrasts to the music and the musician who's playing.
And I mean, you say creating contrasts, is that something that you kind of seek in your work as a composer, like contrasting certain elements? Or
yeah, it's something that interests me very much, and how much we can experience in one moment, so to speak. It's not only contrasts after each other, which also are very interesting in a short time to experience somehow a lot. Like life is usually not so full of different experiences, but music can in a short time open up so many maybe memories or possibilities and layers. And but what's also interesting now, more and more I try to find out how many contrasts can I put in the same moment, and can we still experience different feelings in the same moment, or different thoughts or aspects. Yeah, so this is something I'm elaborating with a lot, and that's why the big formation is so interesting for me right now.
Yeah. It makes me also think about counterpoint. I mean, is that something, is that a useful technique for that?
Yeah, like classical counterpoint, I think in the end makes a quite homogeneous
Right. Okay.
thing again, but counterpoint, if you understand it more visually, like without the historical context, then it could definitely be a counterpoint. Yeah.
It's so interesting what you say about these contrasts existing, because I'm thinking, yeah, in the daily life, of course, we have so many contrasts, but the thing in music is that it's so extreme. It's like you said, a memory or an enormous feeling, and then maybe contrasted with something else, you understand the feeling in a different way, or
Yeah, or something you have never experienced but can magically experience through music or art, or yeah.
And what are some of the, I guess, techniques that you maybe, like, could you give us an example of how you might do that in a 1 minute of music or something, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, for example, in my orchestra music, I really try to start the piece with a contrast in self. So one sound cell is, so to speak, already a contrast, and it's a whip. And then afterwards, this kind of 40 voices, string chords, plus humming, but very, very quiet. And so this is the smallest form that I have written, so to speak, with a contrast, which then becomes one object in a way. And it gets interpreted very differently by different people. But also, for example, that you have a very maybe superficial melody very quietly somewhere, and then you have something very brutal going on anyway that is in a totally different register. So you can still hear this fable, this soft, delicate thing, while something aggressive is going on. And you maybe even can hear it better because something loud is going on. Or also the perspective can change. For example, in my guitar concerto, when the cadenza is, so to speak, the guitarist plays very virtuosic, but all the winds and the whole orchestra actually is playing very high notes and very close to each other. So the whole hall is filled with different notes, shaking, so to speak, and then somehow he plays his cadenza and you can hear it because it's in a low register. But it makes it so much stronger and so much more quiet, and it gives also the musician a totally new experience, I think, that you are not alone there in the orchestra. You're somehow in your own room, where you can play somehow very freely.
Wow, yeah.
In my imagination.
I'm trying to imagine it, because now would be a perfect time to play it if we could. Yeah, no, it's fascinating to think about that. Yeah. What's your daily process like? What do you have a daily routine? Are you a composer that sort of needs quite a structure to your composing if you're taking on a project?
Yeah, I compose in the morning till 11 or something. Sometimes when I don't have much time, I also go up very early, something like 5 or to compose, to have a quiet. And but then I don't do anything more during the afternoon, or I do different things, but not composing. But I have a very structured calendar, so to speak. I plan everything very carefully, so I can reach the deadlines, and also to feel secure. That it's very hard if you know you have to write a piece and then you start somewhere, and I can get a little bit stressed that it's not going to work if I don't have a very worked out plan when I do what. And
yeah, absolutely. Are things like, as a composer, how important is inspiration, for example, and how do you search that? Do you feel that you search inspiration for certain ideas or musical, anything, actually?
Yeah, no, I think it's usually it just comes to you basically in everyday life. When you, I mean, are you searching for it, then you're not going to find it, I think.
Yeah, true.
It's just the problem. But I think reading and art is, of course, always a source of inspiration, but also life itself and society, what's going on, and yeah, all aspects of life.
Do you feel like anything perspective-wise has changed for you? I mean, I'm guessing probably because it's changed for all of us during this time, but have you sort of questioned things differently as a composer during this last year, during such a kind of strange, bizarre year for us?
The weird thing is that composers are not so affected yet, I think, because I have had a full calendar the whole year and I was very busy writing, but without needing to travel in between. But what of course is more frightening is how all these ugly faces of society come out now through Corona. All the problems become so much clearer, and how we're going to face those, and how we get back some beauty.
Yeah.
So I'm not affected as a composer yet, but I'm not happy about it neither, of course. I can, it's quite frightening. Not like the sickness itself so much, but all this what comes out around and so on.
Yeah, and how also our industry specifically might long-term be affected. Certainly. That's
I think so.
yeah. No, you're right. Sometimes when I'm chatting with performers, of course, it's a very, very different time for us because everything's really silent for the first time.
Yeah.
But it's interesting as composers, perhaps if you have the projects and they're happening, then it's in a way probably still your daily life.
It's we are always in the home office. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
nothing special.
Oh. Something I enjoy chatting with my guests on the show about is sort of this idea of what taking risks is in music. And I'm curious how you how you would feel certain risks are as a composer. Do you feel like it's important to take risks, and how do you go out of your comfort zone in that way?
I think you always have to somehow go further, and it doesn't have to be in a historical way or not even in a technical way maybe, but you always have to create something meaningful, otherwise it's useless. And that can be very, I mean, you're naked then, your art is really naked there, and somehow you too. And that's always pushing a boundary for yourself. But then it's also interesting how we can put the musician in this situation, because he or she might not feel so naked. But what material makes the musician feel at the boundary? And that is very differently depending on the formation. If you have a chamber music, the circumstances are precarious, as I call them, much later than if you are working with orchestra, for example, where a derivation from the standard is already very fastly precarious or pushing a boundary. But I think it's the most important thing to push personal boundaries.
I think that's a great point. And that's the hardest. It's the hardest thing to do, to be, and also to trust that you're pushing the right boundaries as well.
Yeah, but it's also okay to fail. I think art that fails is also beautiful and very important, I think. So yeah, actually, yeah, not so much can go wrong. But it's also, now I have written quite a lot, and I somehow more or less know what works, you know,
Yep,
what
yep,
works in a way.
yep.
But then it's very boring to use it. So one has to go on and learn more for oneself all the time. And
Yeah, it's like you're always, I mean, I can relate with that myself too, that you're kind of breaking rules and then those rules form new rules. So then you have to break those new rules and it's just
yeah,
constant.
yeah, thankfully it's like that.
Yeah,
Otherwise, so yeah.
that's true. Um, on a kind of broader level, in a broader sense, what do you feel classical music's role is in society today? And maybe further, how do you feel us as classical musicians as a whole might shape our roles as musicians in society?
Yeah, I think one very important thing is that classical music has to open up. It can't be so exclusive. I think it's important that it goes out on the street, out in the suburbs, and because it's so valuable, it can give so much to people. And then if you have music, I believe you don't need money anymore. You know, it's so fulfilling, and everybody has to get access to it. And then of course not everybody finds his voice in classical music, but I think it can change society, and it's so important that we make it possible for everybody and not only for people who can afford to pay lessons for the children or something. It really has to be a basic need. I feel, yeah, because life is just easier with music. I believe somehow we are all alone, no matter how much family we have or something. But then music can really give you this moment where you somehow are one with the universe or the society, and you somehow get connections clear that were not clear before, in a way that are not objectively graspable, but just from a sentiment. And so I think the very, very most important step is that it's open to everybody, and everybody should be able to get access to classical music. Like in Sweden, there was a time where all the museums were always open. So they were full with little children, and everybody was going to the museum at the weekend. It was just, it was the thing to do. And I think it's wonderful. It will pretend a lot of shit.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And it's about access, and also, I mean, access, I guess, is the beginning point, but it's also, music is a language. So it's about kind of being able to understand that language and speak that language. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I had this very important experience when my family moved to outside Hamburg. And I don't know if you know the people in Hamburg. They're kind of cold and
Sorry, hamburgers.
I love them by now. I love them, and
Yeah.
I understand that it's not meant in a mean way or something. But if you're not used to it, you think, "What have I done wrong?" And then I had these wonderful lessons with Clemens Malich, who is professor at the Hochschule in Hamburg, and we worked on Brahms' sonata for piano and cello. And through Brahms, I got to understand the Nordic German culture somehow. And then I was not offended anymore. It had this gray, coldish thing thing, but it is actually meant good.
Yeah.
So it's also it's a mediator. Music is a mediator also.
Oh, I love that. Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And I can also recall moments like that with composers. Yeah, for example, in Austria, feeling so much smaller, and feeling that when I got to Austria, that I felt I understood this landscape, but I don't know why, but it was just because of Mahler.
Yeah, it's also extreme. Yeah.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts in this lovely chat today. It was really wonderful to hear about a little bit about your music and your philosophy.
Thank you very much. It was very nice talking to you.
And I'm wishing you, all the best for the upcoming projects you have here. And I think you have there's a project coming up on IDAGIO featuring some of your.
It's next week, I think, or 2 weeks, 10th of April.
Okay, great.
Premiere of Himmel.
Of Himmel. And this is for what kind of ensemble?
Collegium Novum Zurich. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'll be tuning in for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, Lisa, thank you so much and have a nice evening and wishing you all the best.
The same to you.